in a microwave, not so far away.
Yeah, it's working.
Lunchables grilled cheesies, crispy, from the microwave.
Hey, got a second? I'm going to show you how I got the flexibility to code, create, and experiment my way. Follow me. Let's
going to be focusing on overcoming loneliness. So today we are thrilled to share with you loneliness and public health, how social connection can heal our communities and ourselves. Our presenter has dedicated her career to public health service, working at District Number 10 Health Department for over 10 years. And she has a shining example of Ludington, where she grew up, and her impact is creating ripples across the vast community that she serves. Please join me in welcoming Katie Miller.
Hello. I'm going to set this down here. Well, thank you, Patty, and thank you all for inviting me here in this space today. I hope to do the topic justice for all of you so that you feel like you are leaving with more information than you came in with, that you're leaving with some energy and some insight on what you can do in your personal life and also in your broader communities to address this growing epidemic of loneliness that we're seeing and experiencing. So just briefly, Patty did a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. I'm very flattered. It makes me feel very formal and official. But just to acknowledge that in my role at District Health Department number 10 as a community health supervisor, I was compensated for my time to prepare this presentation and also to present today. However, I'm not living and breathing this loneliness work every single day in what I do, so I'm presenting today the information that I have at my disposal, but really we all can be energized around this topic and we can all take action in our lives to really address loneliness at a bigger scale. I go by she, her pronouns, and my role at DHD 10 is really as a supervisor of our chronic disease prevention programs, but we do touch into this field of loneliness more and more as it's becoming more of an emerging issue in public health. So my goals for today and kind of the agenda of what I hope that we can get through, I want to lay the groundwork and identify some of the terminology so that we're all kind of speaking the same language about loneliness and social isolation. And I want to also talk through some of the kind of alarming statistics that we're seeing and finding how loneliness actually impacts health for ourselves and also for our bigger communities and society. But as I said before, I really want to leave you all with some tangible resources and some ideas that you can then take back, put into action, and leave feeling a little more hopeful, not necessarily bring us all down too far, and knowing that we can actually take some action to address this. So first and foremost, starting out, how do we define loneliness and social isolation? The way that we're starting to understand this more and more is that social isolation is the objective, the measurable experience of isolation. So it's the frequency of our social interactions, it's the number of social groups that we're involved with, it's the quality of those relationships that we have. Whereas loneliness is our subjective experience. So one person could have the same quote unquote measure of social isolation as someone else, but experience loneliness much differently and much more profoundly, depending on their own unique characteristics in their personal life and their factors. So as we move through the presentation, I use these terms kind of interchangeably, and you'll see them used interchangeably as you look at the research. But if you can kind of keep in mind, loneliness is our experience, isolation is the fact. When we drill down further to loneliness, we find that there's 3 general categories of how we experience loneliness in our life, and we all experience loneliness across these different categories at some point in time throughout the duration of our lifespan. Some can be more profound experiences than others. We can have more chronic loneliness in certain realm of our life, but we're all susceptible to all types of loneliness. No one type of loneliness is more or less important or valuable or worse for us than the other. They're all impactful for our health and our communities. The first is intimate loneliness. So if you think about that as like a one-on-one connection, that intimate partner, that confidant that you have, if you're lacking that you might be longing for that intimate time, that connection with someone. Relational loneliness is the loneliness we experience when we're lacking groups, or a little bit kind of pulling that out a little further to friends groups, to some social networks. And then collective loneliness is the sense that we have disconnection from our broader community. So we may feel isolated within the community where we work, where we live, where we recreate. It's that broader scale of loneliness that we can experience depending on how we perceive our isolation across those 3 different levels. So if we flip the script a little bit, so we have kind of a base understanding of loneliness, a base explanation for isolation. If we now talk about connection, what is actually social connection? Social connection in and of itself is more subjective. So similar to loneliness, it's kind of the flip side of the coin for loneliness. It's a subjective experience. No 2 people have the same description of connection in their life. And what this gets at is that it's beyond just the number of relationships that we have or the number of friendships. It's beyond that structure. And it gets into the actual function and the quality of those relationships. So what is our role? What roles do we play in these different social groups, in these connections that we have? What role and what function do we have at our workplace, within our family, within our friends group, within other community groups we might be involved in? And then the quality is really important here, because it isn't just about the number of connections that we have or the number of friendships or social groups that we're involved in. What's really of importance here is the quality of those connections. So we probably can all think of a time in our life where we may have had many connections through the number of relationships that we have, the frequency of interactions. I'm thinking about my college years, where I lived in a kind of a group space. I was interacting with people every single day. The structure was there. However, how was the quality of those relationships? Did they get to a deeper level? Did we resonate on our values and our general interest areas? Did it really get below the surface? So our own individual level of connection, again, just to reiterate here, it's not just about the number of connections that we have, but it's the function and actually the value that they bring to us and to our lives. Okay, so we have some of the groundwork for some of the terminology with social isolation and loneliness. How big of an issue is this for our society? And how big of is this issue for ourselves? Research is still fairly new on this concept of isolation and loneliness. I think we all remember the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course that expounded upon these issues and really brought it into the forefront and the focus for us. But we now know that loneliness is an experience that about half of us are going through at any given point in time, whether that's intimate loneliness that we are lacking, relational, or that collective loneliness. It's very prevalent in our society and in our communities. What's perhaps a little maybe more alarming, depending on where you're at in your lifespan, is that we've actually seen the largest age demographic group that has these experiences of loneliness is our young adult population. So those that are 18 to 24-year-olds are reporting the highest levels of loneliness in our modern society. Second to that group is our older adult population, so those over 60 years old. They're our second highest age group reporting experiences of loneliness. Furthermore on that, young adults actually have twice the amount of loneliness than older adults. So they're pretty high on the scale if we're looking across the age groups. And if you think about what's happening during the lifespan between young adulthood, kind of that middle adulthood, and then into older adulthood, maybe that makes sense for you why those experiences of social isolation could be happening at those different phases. I'm kind of hitting you with a little bit of a wall of data here. I don't expect we're not going to dive into every single data point here, but essentially what I'm wanting us to see and understand here is that this has grown exponentially over time, and it's continuing to grow. We're starting to understand this full picture of loneliness a little bit better than we have in the past, but we're seeing some trends and patterns that are a little bit worrisome. So things like engagement in our community, we're seeing that dropping off. Participation in civic organizations, church membership, as we all may know, has declined to almost record level lows for our society. But also people are reporting that they feel more isolated than ever before. And this is even coming out of the unique experience of the COVID-19 pandemic into more recent years. We haven't really made any strides to come back or to delay any of this onset. What's also important to note here is that overall trust in each other is declining and continues to decline. The most recent statistic that I found for this presentation was from 2016, where only 30% of us were reporting that we trust other people. It's not even about trusting our government, our institutions, it's just trusting each other. That's declined since the 1970s when they first really started reporting on that. And I would guess, given how divided we've become in our society, that level of trust has continued to decline in more recent years since 2016. But really what this is trying to paint for us is that this is something we need to start paying attention to. If we have 16% of people reporting that they feel attached to their local community, that's a pretty low proportion of our community that feels connected to their general community. So it's something we should start paying attention to. Overall prevalence, so we know that about half of us are experiencing or reporting that we're experiencing loneliness. Who is at higher risk? I want to just give you a moment to kind of read through and just personally reflect on this list that the research says these groups are at an elevated risk for loneliness. So my initial reaction to reading this list was, who isn't on this list? I can find myself identifying with at least one or two or more of these special populations. So what that's telling me on the one hand is we likely all have some level of elevated risk for loneliness. It's dependent, of course, on where we're at in our life, what experiences we might have going on. On the other hand, though, there's pocket populations that the research is telling us we need to be looking out for these groups. And those are populations that are experiencing marginalization, discrimination, bias, and prejudice in their daily life, whether that's through their personal interactions, their workplace, comings and goings throughout the community, that are making them feel and believe that they're isolated and alone in their experience. So I just want to be mindful of that. Loneliness is a threat to all of us, but for some of us, it's an even elevated threat. All right, so how does it impact our health? I promise I'll lift us back up soon, but we do need to talk about what does this mean for our personal health? before we switch gears and kind of pull the curtain back a little further to understanding how it impacts our community. So, unfortunately, consistently across research studies and various psychology, neuroscience, biology, etc., the findings are not good. It's not looking good for us, for those that experience loneliness and isolation throughout our lives. We find that those that are reporting that are seeing elevated risks for things like heart disease, for premature death, so mortality, morbidity. They're struggling with other health issues like depression, self-harm, suicide, anxiety at higher levels than those who do not report social isolation or loneliness. Interestingly, we're starting to understand the impact that social isolation in childhood can have on the trajectory of that individual's life. So a child that experiences social isolation and loneliness may see and may be at an increased risk for things like obesity, high blood pressure, and an increased blood glucose level when they reach adulthood. So clearly there's something happening biologically due to this isolation and this loneliness experience. It's also associated with lower work performance. So we're thinking about like how we live out in the world, how we build a sense of value and purpose in our life. We're seeing that work performance, educational attainment, even things like your income prospect is impacted by your experience of loneliness and social isolation. And then the image on the right, something we like to do in public health is that we like to draw you in with a comparison to show you need to care about this. So with this image, this is from the U.S. Surgeon General report from 2023. It's telling you with that grabby headline of lacking social connection is as dangerous as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. That may feel like a little alarmist. Whoa, that's really intense. The intention of that isn't to say these other things are, it's okay, it's better than, we're now negating those other health behaviors. What it's trying to show you is that we need to care about this, because what we're actually finding is that social isolation taken alone without these other health behaviors of smoking, heavy alcohol use, has this strong impact for early death, for premature death and higher risk of mortality, taken on its own, regardless of other health behaviors or health diagnoses. Another way to look at this is to reflect back on our prevalence. So we know now, okay, about half of us are experiencing loneliness at any given time. We know that that's going to increase our risk for these health outcomes, for early mortality, for other morbidities. How does that look for the prevalence of these other conditions that we compared on the last slide for mortality? What we find is that loneliness is more prevalent than these three other conditions or behaviors. So smoking rates are at historic lows. We've had success in that realm. When we look at diabetes, we know that diabetes is also associated with early mortality, but the rate compared to the prevalence of loneliness is much lower, and obesity rates are also lower. The reason I bring that up is just because I think we all are aware of and have heard about these other three conditions or health behaviors and their impact on our health and well-being, but how much have we heard about loneliness's impact on our health and well-being, now knowing it is a more prevalent issue than these others? So how exactly does social connection impact our health, whether that's positive or negative? We now know of it as a health risk, so we can think of it as a risk factor. That's the terminology that we use in the health world. When something is a risk factor, it poses risks for your health. How does it do that? Well, there's three different fields of science to note in how that this interplay of social connection impacts our personal health. But we find that it impacts our biology through gene expression, through the way that our stress hormones are released, so our cortisol levels are elevated when we're socially isolated. It also creates inflammation in our body, similar to that of someone that is physically inactive. So it's good to understand that there's a biological connection to social isolation. There's also, of course, the psychological aspect, which I think is probably one of the first things we know and think about. When someone is feeling disconnected, isolated, and alone, their sense of meaning and purpose in life is going to be different than it would be if they were connected. Same for their resilience and their feeling of hopefulness. And then it plays into our behaviors as well. So we notice an association with health behaviors and our rating of loneliness, in that those who feel lonely or experience loneliness are going to also have a higher association with some of the health behaviors that can compound these risks for the health outcomes, some of which I've listed on the bottom of the slide, but the others that we talked about a couple slides back. Another way to think about this, if you want to kind of shift your thought of it all being negative, is that we can also think of social connection as a protective factor. So there's also the flip side coin of this, of social connection has the power to protect us from these harms listed on the bottom through these different channels, through our biology, through the psychology, our mental health, and then subsequently through our health behaviors. So it's not a causal relationship, it's really kind of this interweb of association across all of these different realms. One other thing I want to note as far as this personal impact of loneliness and isolation, I found this really great resource from Stanford University. I thought this was really helpful. Again, echoing that this is not a black and white solution. This isn't about going out and creating more connections to improve your personal loneliness. Even high quality connections, yes, that's important, but I want us to pay attention to this purple bubble on the bottom left, which if you can't see that, says healthy solitude. And this is the idea that in order for us to be socially connected, to build our social relationships with others, to build upon our collective sense of purpose and community, we need to focus inward, and we need to ensure that we have solitude and health within ourselves before we can then seek out those improved connections with others. So I really liked that concept because I think it can, sometimes when we're experiencing loneliness, or if we know someone that's in that realm of loneliness, it can be hard to think about that because you're alone, you're isolated. If we can improve our sense of solitude with ourself and feel known by ourselves and loved and valued within ourselves, it can help to buffer us through phases of life where isolation is going to be unavoidable. So I think it's really important for us to know that this is an area that we can work on within ourselves that can help protect us from those periods of loneliness as well. I forgot to give the disclaimer. I apologize. I don't believe the QR codes are working on these slides, but they will be available at the end of today or coming soon on the website for the Humankind series. So I apologize if you've tried to access them. Okay, so now if we're scaling this out and we're thinking about how isolation and loneliness, we understand this impacts our personal health. How does this play a role in our communities, in our neighborhoods, our workplaces? Again, the science is showing us that, and this makes sense, of course, that when we pull out a community of lonely people and we look at that impact on the bigger community, we're going to see these similar, same negative outcomes. What I included for today, that again, this could be a whole separate conversation and presentation. For those that are wondering, that are like financially leaning, that want to know, well, what's the actual cost to society for loneliness? There is studies and there is data points that you can pull out to show how much this really does cost us as a society. There's a huge cost for Medicare expenses, for hospitalizations. But what I think is really the most important thing to pull from this and this community impact is the bottom two bullet points, in that it's going to impact our full population health when we now have, as I said, a community where half of the people are lonely and isolated. But let's shift the thought a little bit and find out what the studies are showing with us with how social connection can impact our community's health. Social connection can be a protective factor not only for ourselves, but also for our communities. And what studies are showing us now is that communities that have high levels of social connection, where the residents say that they feel valued, supported, they feel like they have a lot of high value connections in the community, they feel they feel welcomed and valued in their community, those communities have better resilience in natural disasters. So actually their emergency response during floods, fires, what have you, is better when the community is connected. At a neighborhood scale, if you think about a neighborhood that the residents feel connected, they feel like they can lean on each other, there's a faster response rate when a crisis happens in that neighborhood when they have that connection, because they trust in each other, they value and care about each other. You also see this coming to light with things like economic prosperity. So when you have a community where your citizens and your residents feel engaged with their bigger community, they feel like they're a valued asset and member of the community, there's higher economic prosperity because there's more of an emphasis on local business and building up those local business owners, giving back to the community. There's also more representation among local government. And what that essentially means is that when residents feel valued and connected in their community, they're more likely to get involved with their local government, to run for local office, and to be the representation of their community members and the constituents in that community when they feel like, essentially, they have a purpose, they're valued. The social capital in a well-connected community is also associated with, so on the flip side of that, decreased mortality rates for the community, higher reports of self-reported health outcomes. So people not only are getting diagnosed at lower levels for some of these health issues, but they're reporting that they feel more healthy as well. And then lower hospital admission rates. So better utilization of preventative care, primary care, in communities that feel like they have high social engagement and connection. High value social engagement and connection. Additional literature is finding that even in communities that have been historically marginalized because of structural systems that have disconnected them. So if you think of these as the policies, the systems, the way the environment was like designed, the literal infrastructure of a community that has divided communities, redlining, other examples of things where marginalized communities are pushed out or kind of separated from their general community. Even in communities such as this, when you can now flip and start implementing pro-connection policies, you start to see a change across the scale in some of the things we just mentioned, in health, reportings of health, and higher engagement and social connection. And those pro-connection policies can be things as simple as complete streets in a community, shifting the focus of the streets that run through a community to being, emphasizing efficiency, speed, and cars, to being more emphasized around pedestrian safety, bike safety, clearly marked walking and riding lanes within the lanes of a road that emphasizes more of that social engagement and communicates to the community that you're safe and you're welcome here to recreate and to navigate through your community. What does this mean for our rural areas? A lot of the research I know over time, there's been frustrations that rural communities, we often get left out of research studies. A lot of studies are done in more urban areas, bigger cities, and it sometimes can be hard to think, well, how does this relate to my community and where I live? We don't have, multiple bus stops. We don't have public transit. We don't have these other resources that other communities may have that would be easier to make those changes in. So what do? This is another resource that is very valuable specifically for this topic of how we can improve social connection in rural communities, specifically for older adults and adults with disabilities. So I encourage you to look at that when the link is available today. But essentially, you're not alone in this, and this is actually something that's starting to work well is that we're starting to research and understand the uniqueness of rural communities and what rural communities actually need in order to impact social connection. So we know all these things. I could, include additional statistics around how rural communities are unique, but this is not new information for us, for those of us that live, work, or have grown up in rural areas. We know that broadband issues are here and that there's transportation challenges for folks. We know that people are geographically isolated from each other. People may live on acreage, far from neighbors, and that's a value for some in rural areas. But there's still things we can do in our rural areas to build social connection, and we can build upon the values and norms of the communities and what's working well to create and enhance social connection and move from there, rather than looking at our rural area and saying, there's nothing we can do because we can't change the infrastructure. Well, there's other things we can look at different scales in that community. So what I've been touching on throughout the presentation that may be new information or may be familiar to some of you is essentially the social ecological model. So this is a public health model of the different levels of influence in a society. So this image here on the left is from the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory report. It's one way of looking at what is the social ecological model. This next slide might be more familiar. This is kind of the traditional picture of what the social ecological model is. But essentially how this relates to loneliness is that this is not a one and done solution. It's an all and everything. Everything is equally valid and valuable as far as impacting loneliness and social isolation. So it's yes, there's value in changing our behaviors, our beliefs, our opinions about loneliness and social isolation, stepping out of our comfort zone to make connections. But it's also, just as importantly, about advocating for policies that are pro-connection policies that can then trickle down to our local communities and help to support social connection. It's things like interpersonal dynamics, so peer mentoring groups, things we can do within our family and friends group to build social connection. And then it's our institutional or organizational policies and things that are in place at work sites, schools, what have you, that promote or hinder social connection. And then we've talked a bit about community. That's another layer of this scale as well. So we need to address all levels of this social ecological system that we live in today in order to impact loneliness. This is just another example of a tangible resource we can walk away with. And this is the social framework. It's from the Foundation for Social Connection. This is a wonderful resource. Again, we don't need to start from scratch. We don't need to do this alone. There's a lot of resources and tools at our disposal that we can utilize, and we're not alone in this, working with others, looking at what other communities are doing, finding other populations, whether it's community colleges or rural communities, how are they addressing this? This is one other example of what's taking shape in the national sphere for addressing social connection. The U.S. Surgeon General has also come up with some strategies of how we can really advance social connection across that social ecological model, whether it's individually or at kind of that higher system approach. And what he essentially came up with was these 6 pillars of advancing social connection. So there's things as simple as things we can do in our own personal lives, deepening our knowledge and understanding. Events like this where we can educate ourselves, educate each other, start some conversations about loneliness to kind of generate ideas and conversation. And then there's larger scale things, reforming the digital environment. That's not going to be something we can achieve tomorrow, but it's something that as a society we can and should be working towards in order to improve and enhance social connection. So reflecting on this specifically, where could we start? How does this fit in with my daily life, what I can reasonably do, what I am well positioned and capable of in my life? It could be as simple as a personal change, or it could be something where we're advocating or networking with policy makers about how we can improve social connection. Oh, wrong way. I believe this is my last kind of note to drill down back to what we can personally do in our lives. But I felt that this was really important to flesh out different types of ways that we can make personal connections and how that can potentially impact social connection at a broader scale. Ways that we can improve the health of our communities and the social connection of our communities range from bonding within those that think, act, and value the same things that we do. This is probably the easiest and the most common thing, right? We want to spend time with people that we like and enjoy and agree with. That's easy for us. That's what we naturally gravitate towards. But in order to really have transformational community change, to become more socially connected, I challenge us all to consider bridging and linking our social connections. And bridging essentially is diversifying the relationships that we have to those that we don't naturally gravitate towards. We may disagree on a lot of things. We have different values, interests, experiences. Linking social capital is looking at different power structures in our communities and making connections with others who are at different positions of power. And the reason I think this is important is that really one of the main points I want to make today is that we cannot continue to operate in only the bonding social capital realm for our personal connections. In order to make progress and see community level change, we need to really challenge ourselves and others to step into that discomfort zone, to build bridges of social connection with those we may not agree with, and to make links with others that maybe we're not talking about or we're not inviting into these spaces, but they're experiencing marginalization. They're at an increased risk for isolation and loneliness. They need to be in the conversation too. So just some personal reflection here. I think it's important whenever we're trying to explore new ways of doing things or new ways of living our lives, we need to build intentional time to reflect on ourselves. I think that's coming across here, is that's something that I really encourage after today, is to do some personal reflection of what could we do differently within our own individual lives, but also at these other levels of influence, at the interpersonal level, within our friends group or other social groups that we may not engage with. What can be done at institutional level, within organizations, within our communities, and then more broadly within our federal, state, local government, the society at large, those policies, those systems, and the way that our environment is designed. What can we do to see transformational change and to improve social connection? Again, we don't need to do it alone. There's many resources out there. The link that I had included on this slide was actually a catalog. There's an Excel spreadsheet that an organization has been compiling interventions and programs that build social connection. So there is a laundry list of example resources that you can look at to see if you're feeling lost or confused about where to start. There's some of that work has been done for us. So for me, when I think about what does social connection look like at the individual, interpersonal, community, institutional level, I think of things like peer support groups, joining a club or organization that aligns with my values, advocating for a workplace to have a peer coaching program to support employees that might be struggling. I think of policies that compensate grandparents for providing childcare for their grandchildren so that they can remain in the home and they can build that kind of familial connection. I think about complete streets, communities that are completely shifting the landscape and the infrastructure of their communities to encourage slowing down, socializing, connecting with the other people that we speed past in our vehicles every day. I think about the potential of technology to keep us connected in beneficial ways instead of driving us apart and creating divisive division within our society. I think about programs that encourage our children to communicate and to interact regularly with older populations in our group, bringing kindergarten classes into nursing homes, assisted living facilities to do activities, just creating more opportunities for that regular connection and engagement. But I also think of some local examples as well. I think about the 10 spot and how an unused community space was transformed into a space for gathering and socialization, and how there's a give back program at some of the local businesses where tips that are collected are then given back out to the community. I think about things like little libraries that are popping up in neighborhoods, or the Ludington or Scottville Cares boxes that we see. Ludington Cares box being outside the library in Ludington. Those little threads, those little lifelines that are being thrown out to create little sparks of connection already. And what else can we do? So again, some reflection, connection questions, I'm gonna sit us in a little awkward silence for a moment because I want to allow you to read through these without my voice speaking over it. So I'll just give you a moment to just kind of think to yourself about some of these reflection questions. How can we start, whether it's building a sense of healthy solitude in ourselves before we seek connection outside of ourselves? How can we identify in ourselves when we're experiencing loneliness and what we can do, who we can turn to for our personal health? But then how can we also take that and bring it outward? How can we engage, encourage, advocate for social connection in our organizations, our workplaces, our schools? What can we do about our local policies that prevent us from engaging, or those bigger societal issues that are going to take a long time to upend? Before I close out, I have referenced quite a bit through the presentation some work that the U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy has come out with. I highly encourage you, the first thing, if this is a topic area of interest to you and you have not already read these resources, I encourage you to go out and find them. They are just a wealth of information, anecdotes, resources, just really robust review. He has done a lot of the work for us as far as identifying this research and why we should care. I had listened to it on an audiobook through Libby. If you're not familiar with the Libby app, you can freely access your local libraries through audiobooks, Melcat. Your libraries are a wonderful resource. If there's a financial barrier or you just don't want to commit to purchasing a book, check with your libraries for sure. But the report that he came out with in 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory, is freely accessible as well. It's on the unworkable QR code on the screen that you'll have to wait to get. But that's freely accessible as well. And again, that's a wealth of information. But this quote really spoke to me, and it was really kind of pulled at my heartstrings reading that. And I think that's kind of what the purpose and maybe what brought you to kind of hearing more about this. But I'll just give you a moment to just read that. Hopefully that will sit and resonate with you as it did for me before we close out. But I'm not going to read it because I'm overly emotional and I don't want to cry in front of a group of almost all strangers. Some additional resources. So again, as I've said kind of throughout my presentation, this is not something, it is a new and growing realm of work. I'm happy to see that it is a priority for our nation and also for West Shore Community College. It's wonderful that this Humankind series is happening and you're going to continue to learn and explore this topic. I will say again, there's so much information out there. There's so many resources out there. We do not need to do this work alone. There's some wonderful things like the Social Health Labs organization, they provide mini grants, $1,000 every single month to a community to do a connection activity, to build connection. It could be whatever. That's one example. There's Commit to Connect. This is an organization that has resources for any type of really situation you can think of, rural communities. They have a listserv where you can get involved in kind of a community group conversations online to discuss this topic, to share information. There's the Foundation for Social Connection, which has numerous webinar opportunities. They have several press briefings about the topic of social connection and lots of resources, opportunities to further engage and understand all of this. And that's all that I have. I will leave you with this final quote by Dr. Murthy, who this was edging on the point of being a dissertation of his book, apparently, but just really knowledgeable about the topic of loneliness. And if we have any questions, I think we still have some time for some questions. So thank you so much.
Stand up. Kelly, thank you for coming and talking with us today. As we all know, we recently had another school shooting, and I think there's a real strong connection with the loneliness of our youth and violence against themselves or others. Can you tell us more about what is available in our own community to reach out to youth, particularly those who might be lonely or feel disconnected or don't have a sense of purpose or feel that they don't belong?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I might put somebody on the spot that's at the back of the room. So as far as our engagement, like the health department, what we're aware of course the schools are the most natural outlet for finding out what resources we have. Here in Mason County, something that our community has been working on is establishing an interconnected system for youth mental health. Essentially what that is trying to align mental health providers. So there's been a growing effort to install mental health providers in schools. That's much more commonplace now than it was in the past. So there's been a big effort of doing that, but it was disjointed. So I'm not saying anything to name names or anything, but let's say, CMH has funds to install a mental health provider in the schools, but then the school district also has money that they can have a mental health counselor or provider in the schools. There was still kind of this disjointedness that we were seeing not in only Mason County, but many schools and communities. So that's one example of an effort that's been in place in Mason County, is to talk, essentially for providers to be talking, retaining, of course, HIPAA and the compliance that they need to comply with for their purposes of their practice. But just to have better communication between mental health providers that are working within the schools and the schools themselves. So there's this kind of communication loop of what students are struggling with, what they need, who they can go to, what else do we need in the schools to support them, and what's coming up from them. Anything else from the ladies in the back that you want to note? So there's youth mental health first aid. That's a training that's available. I believe West Michigan CMH has providers that can provide that training. I know we have some people that are certified in youth mental health training through the health department as well. And MSU Extension also is a provider of youth mental health training. So that is a training that is available to community members, to youth. I know there's been an effort to get youth actually trained in responding to mental health crises among their peers. What else? The schools would be a definite, I don't know if there's anyone from any of the local schools here. I would put them on the spot too.
Hi, Katie.
Hi.
One of the things that Pamela Blair and I have come upon was the state program of, what is it? Protect to Prevent.
Yes.
I believe. Could you share a little insight on that and how it's impacting our school preparedness and
Yes.
awareness of youth who are struggling?
Yes. I'm going to put Erin on the spot again. So we have a couple of local health educators who I'm so glad you joined, because Erin actually works in this. So through the interconnected systems framework work that I've just been talking about. So that was it's a convening of school, CMH, the health department, and others who have been convening regularly for the last couple of years. Prevent to Protect has come up. It is now a service that's provided in our community. Erin, can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Is it? Okay. So Prevent to Protect is through the ESD, so the Educational Service District, and it's really targeted towards those high-level or high-risk behavior students. So maybe they've been identified as needing some extra intensive behavioral health supports or mental health supports, or maybe the schools have OK to Say, which is a tip line to report bullying or threats made against the school, and those students are identified that way. And they're connected with a care team at Michigan State University, actually. We have 2 staff people based at the ESD who are kind of the regional case managers and mentors for that, but they're connected with the whole care team at Michigan State University, and they're given a full psychological evaluation, connected with services they might not have in this region, and really the whole family is brought in. So the parents are on board, the whole family is looked at, and supports are given to them in that way. So it's a very high level, they refer to it in the schools as tier 3, so those high level or high needs beyond what can be provided here in our community or within the school district.
Yep.
So when, I'll stand up. So, oh, geez. Okay. So when you were kind of talking about the, on one of your slides, you were talking about like where it was individuals and then it was like family relationships, and then went to community and institutional, and then state or federal level.
Mm-hmm.
What does that kind of look like when it's at the federal level? Like, can you delve in more to that and like how it would trickle down between each, like how it would work as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from a public health perspective, again, I do not claim to be an expert on government. I'm not a political scientist by any means, but in my role in public health, we are impacted by the federal government. When the federal government prioritizes funding for certain health issues, let's say, they make a declaration of a public health crisis, and then they budget for that within the federal budget. We see that then distributed to states, so then that funding will go to the states for that priority area. States then, this is an oversimplification, but essentially then are responsible for then issuing that out within the state to different communities. So it can look like competitive grant funding that might be available across the state that different organizations are allowed to apply for from the state, from MDHHS, that they can leverage in their local community. Or it could be non-competitive. It could be something that's written into the state budget and it's issued to all of the local public health departments to respond to. So that's a very oversimplification. There's a lot of it's kind of complex depending on what we're talking about here. But we don't need to wait on the federal government to decide what we do either, is what I want to say with that, is that it's not that we have to be held back by that. There's a lot of power in our local communities, and that's why today I really wanted to emphasize that community level. Because my experience in working with federal programs is it takes a while. A lot of that takes a long time. There's a lot built into the politics of different decisions and things, and we may not see funding from the federal government for certain things for years to come when the crisis is happening now. So really the power lies in our local communities to explore and to do some of this work and to decide for ourselves what we're going to do in the meantime, not to sit and wait on our, I don't want to say anything that's going to get me in trouble, federal government to step in and solve for us, essentially.
So then on a personal level, how could an individual maybe become more connected to their community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's going to vary, of course, because it depends a lot on your values, your beliefs, your interest areas. What I have discovered, I mean, from doing this work, for research purposes, for just my own personal interest area, but what I'm trying to do in my own life is, again, I'm going to look back at that healthy solitude first. That's what makes sense for me. That may not make sense for everybody, but that's what I see as being kind of that initial step of change is I need to develop a sense of healthy solitude, belief and trust and value in my own self before I'm going to go and make connections. It can happen simultaneously. If you are a person that has, that doesn't need to be the first step, but I think that that's really important because it can be challenging to build valuable, meaningful connections with others if we don't first know who we are. So that's why I would say that. But then I would say, I think, maybe a next step would be starting with that, building your bonded social capital. So reaching out to find others that have the same interests as you or the same values and opinions, building a community within your own social networks around similar topic areas of interests. That's going to be a natural stepping point. The challenge that we find is that if we get too ingrained in our own bubble of those that we bond and connect with and we don't build bridges out, this is where we kind of run into trouble. This is where we see division in our communities, is if we're too much ingrained in those social bonded bubbles. We do need to have those bridges. So it may start with finding those personal connections of things that you gravitate towards, naturally your interest areas, but then I would really encourage and challenge everyone to looking outside of our social networks and our natural interest areas and building bridges with others. It might be uncomfortable, but that's my recommendation.
Hi. I just had a question because I know this might be common in some families. So what happened in my family, for instance, one of my family members, they got older and they reached the point of dementia and they completely turned and they filed a lawsuit, and I eventually turned into loneliness, and I kind of shoved myself in a box, and I didn't really talk to anybody for at least 4 years. And I'm still kind of in that point. Is there any, and I know that's fairly common for most people when they get into that phase, because I know that's happened to several people that I've reached out to and talked to, because I know we're not the only family that's happened to. Is there any way that families like us, is there any way that we can find people to talk to about that, where we can find groups that we can talk to, find people to reach out to, that we don't feel that way, because it's easy to shut ourselves in and be in that box.
Yeah. Do you have a suggestion for that?
Yeah, you have. Thank you. Obviously, I'm a lot older than you, but I do know that Scottville Senior Center has once a month a conversation with people who are dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's in their life, whether it's a loved one or whatever. I've not been to those meetings, but that is something that's once a month, I know, and I don't think you have to be a senior to go.
Thank you. Thank you for your vulnerability too in sharing that and stepping up, speaking to that. I think it's so important, and that is exactly why we need to build social connection. We need to change norms in our community where it's okay to reach out for help and to make these resources well-known and available to those, regardless of when someone is struggling, because we're going to be experiencing that through our lifespan. So I'm sure there are online grief meetings as well, or other resources, but it's great to know that there is a local resource for right now. Yeah.
So I think that's all the time that we have for questions for today. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. I want to thank Katie for sharing her expertise with us one final time. And please do take a moment as you're leaving to scan the QR code. It's really important to us for you to fill out that survey. We appreciate you being here, but that would be a huge benefit to us. So thank you all. Enjoy the afternoon.